Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. It is time once again for some summer vacationing vicariously through mystery novels, and this time we are going on vacation with Albert Campion in Margery Allingham's Coroner's Pidgin, celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2025. And Campion's vacation is back to London because he's been on the continent during the war, and he's finally on leave to London for a little bit. And as I've said in the past, this is my absolute favorite Albert Campion novel and what I would consider the best Campion novel. What books are my favorites and what books I think are the best quality are not always the same, but they do line up here. But as always, I will give a spoiler free summary up until the time of the murderer reveal, at which point I will let you know it's coming so you can back out if you need to, because from that point forward, spoilers are fair game. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Coroner's Pidgin has one of the best openings to any mystery novel ever, certainly the best for a Campion novel. It begins with our favorite ex-con turned sidekick, Lugg, and a rather distinguished old woman carrying a corpse up the stairs to Albert Campion's flat. Campion has just arrived at his flat and is soaking in the bathtub. He's just returned home from 3 years doing secretive war work on the continent. Apparently, the work was so secretive, even Campion didn't even know what it was. But he is not in the mood for anything to disrupt his relaxing bath because he hasn't relaxed in years and he has a train to catch that he does not want to miss. Unfortunately for Campion, he is still in the bath when Lugg and the woman dump the corpse on his bed. And as much as he would rather just leave, Campion confronts Lugg about this, and the situation is a bit complicated. In Campion's absence, Lugg has taken work at Carrados Square, which is the home of the Carrados family, this aristocratic family, but since the war began, only one side of the square still stands, and that's where Johnny Carrados lives. He is the Marquis, and his mother, the Dowager Marchioness, is the old woman who aided Lugg with the body. Corrado Square was turned into this hub of wartime activity. There's all kinds of war efforts going on there, most importantly, ambulance drives. Lady Corrados found this dead woman in her son's bed and decided to move it before her son returned. Because Johnny is engaged to marry a girl named Susan, who is actually with Lugg and Lady Corrados here. Susan drives an ambulance, and Lugg sometimes helps when he's not raising his pet pig, whom we will meet later. No one knows who the dead woman is, but Lugg says she committed suicide. But they moved the body to prevent a scandal, and now that he's caught up in it, Campion might as well just stay and help out. But Campion very much wants to leave, but more people keep showing up at his flat. First to arrive is Don Evers, a friend of Susan's who was waiting outside. He seems very protective of Susan, but when questioned, it doesn't appear he actually saw Lugg and Lady Carrados carrying the body. Then Johnny Carrados arrives as his mother called for him. He shows up with Evangeline Eve Snow, who is a woman Johnny definitely had a relationship with in the past, and that relationship doesn't appear to have slowed down despite his engagement to Susan. We also learn Susan, despite being very young, has been married before. She married when she was 19 and widowed a week later. Also with Johnny and Eve is Dolly Chivers, who is a young girl who is Johnny's social secretary. This being the war, so servants are not readily available. You sort of get the feeling she's more of these like quasi servant types taking on all kinds of roles because there are no servants available. Those three, however, do recognize the dead body. The victim here is Moppet Lewis, and she's basically Johnny's stalker. Moppet, many years prior, had apparently just inserted herself into Johnny's group of elite friends, including at one point trying on some of the women's clothes and just basically moving into Corrado Square uninvited. They did eventually get rid of her, so it's been a while since anyone has seen Moppet. Lady Carrados found Moppet dead in Johnny's bed with a glass of water and a medication beside her, which makes it look like suicide. How she got there in the first place is unknown because Dolly said she wasn't there the previous night when she locked the building up. Campion is insistent that everyone there should just handle themselves because he has a train to catch. And he recommends going as a group to Scotland Yard and speak with his old friend Stanislaus Oates, who has recently been promoted to Chief Inspector of the Criminal Division, and telling him just exactly what happened because Oates will understand and he'll be helpful. Johnny Corrados pulls Campion aside and asks him for help because he's getting married in 2 days and he doesn't want any scandal until after the wedding. And Campion's like, well, that's too bad. I gotta catch this train. So Johnny hails Campion a cab, only of course this cab isn't a real cab, and Campion winds up temporarily kidnapped and chloroformed. He wakes up on the street corner the next day, having missed his train. Oates comes to him and says there's some trouble afoot in his flat. It seems the group did go to Scotland Yard to report the crime, only there's a couple of issues. Lady Corrado said she found the body in the basement of her house, which is number 20 Corrado Square, not in Johnny's house at number 3. Also, Lady Corrados claimed she called Johnny to come over to Campion's, but he wasn't home, so Peter Onier came instead. Peter Onier and his wife Gwenda are old friends of Johnny's. That doesn't match Campion's story that he tells Oates. And oh yeah, Moppet, not Muppet, sorry, was murdered. She did not commit suicide. She was smothered after being drugged. And Oates is still friendly to Campion here, but he's not really as friendly as he used to be. He doesn't want Campion to leave London, so no train ride for him. He also questions Campion's mental state ever since he had amnesia, which is something that happened in Trader's Purse, which was the previous novel 4 years prior. There was a big publication gap in the Campion novels here. And Campion is not really a suspect because Moppet was dead when Campion was still at sea, but she was found in his house, and there is a chance, his memory is just not as good, which the reader knows is not true, but Oates, to Oates, it is true. And Lugg has gone missing. So Campion travels with Peter Onier to Corrado Square, where all of the people we met, plus a few other people, like Ricky Silva, there's a Captain Gold, and we've learned here that Johnny's wedding to Susan has been delayed because his father-in-law said so. His father-in-law, whom he calls the Admiral, is just taking everything over until this murder is straightened out, but there's a lot of tension between all of these people because of Johnny's marriage, which many don't want to happen. Campion notes that the war and the Blitz have really damaged the fabric that holds people together, with many of these people just fighting at the snap of their fingers. Gwenda Onier calls out Ricky Silva for not wanting the marriage to happen because he's freeloading off of Johnny, and Ricky snaps back that she's basically doing the same thing. And Lady Corrados is just completely over her head. I mean, Campion suspects her lies are because she simply doesn't understand the gravity of the situation she's in. Ricky momentarily leaves the room and returns with a package addressed to Johnny. Johnny is infuriated when he opens it and finds an artificial rose wrapped around some pearls. And Campion recognizes the wrapping as being very old, which is odd because this is supposed to be a wedding present. And Gwenda Onier recognizes the rose as coming from his old costume box they used for charades and stuff. Campion is very awkward at Corrado Square. He feels out of place, even though he knows these people. These people are his friends, but again, he's been away from them for so long, he feels like a complete outsider. And Dolly Chivers tells him that since the war started, everyone is at their wits' end. No one gets along. Gwenda has basically made herself mistress of the house, which is why she doesn't want Johnny to get married, because that mistress of the house will now be Susan. So Campion takes Susan out for dinner at the Minoan restaurant. Campion notes that all of his favorite restaurants are now destroyed or closed since the war began. But the Minoan is operated by restaurateur Stavros, whom Campion does know. And Stavros actually thought Campion died, which another example here of the war affecting London society. I actually think Coroner's Pidgin just might be the best mystery novel in terms of the way its author depicts the state of London during the war and its effects on the people who live there. We do tend to get a lot of post-war stuff along this lines that I love, but this is really one of the best during the war itself. It's truly remarkable. But while at this restaurant, Campion wonders about like what kind of food he's gonna get because remember, food rationing is in effect, and he wonders about the wine as well. But he sees a Theodore Bush at the Minoan, and Bush is an expert in wine, so Campion assumes the wine is okay. And he also asks Susan about Don Evers, with the implication that Susan and Don are in love. Susan sort of hedges here, but she does admit that like she doesn't really want to marry Johnny, but now she feels awkward about calling it off because everyone will think it had to do with the dead woman, but it really has nothing to do with Moppet. Johnny just felt obligated to marry Susan after her husband was killed because he served with Johnny, who asked him to watch over Susan. But there's an affection between Johnny and Susan, but there's no love there. Theodore Bush approaches Campion. Bush owned this wine museum that housed a lot of wine related items and expensive wines. A lot of the memorabilia was destroyed in the war, but very little of the wine was destroyed, or at least that's what Bush says. One wine that was lost belonged to Campion's uncle, but we're told it's not the port. The port apparently is much better than the wine here. All of the other wine was transported out of the museum for safekeeping. Meanwhile, Superintendent Yeo, I really should listen to the audiobook to learn how to pronounce his name because I really don't know. It's spelled Yeo. Comes to the restaurant and pulls Campion away. The body has been identified, and again, we know it's Moppet Lewis, but Moppet Lewis, unbeknownst to most other people, was actually married to Stavros, the restaurant owner. Stavros claims they were estranged, although he loved her and they never lived together, which is also very odd. Moreover, the taxi cab Campion was kidnapped in was found in the alley near the restaurant. Stavros claims the taxi isn't operational and the restaurant is just storing it there for the owner. Campion speaks to this elderly waiter who has a real habit of slipping up here. I mean, first he mentioned that Johnny dined with Eve Snow 2 days prior when Johnny was supposed to be out of the country. Then he mentions that Moppet Stavros and her husband had a big fight shortly before she died, where she mentioned she didn't know if she could keep her promise, whatever that may mean. Evers shows up at the restaurant to speak with Campion. Evers' father is a rival wine connoisseur to Theodore Bush. Evers knows nothing about wine himself, but Bush has invited him to taste this very rare 1904 wine called Les Enfants Doux, which almost no one has ever heard of, and there is an implication that this wine might not be real wine, but Evers' father, who is in America, says it is real, and Evers invites Campion to the tasting. Suddenly, a big fight erupts with Stavros chasing around the other partner, a Mr. Peary, around with a knife, which really must have been some sight in this restaurant. Campion pays a visit to Johnny and Eve, and Johnny more or less has just nothing to say other than lamenting everyone's changed personality since the war began. No one is the same, and the war has forced people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Eve is worried about Johnny, and Campion asks her if she deliberately introduced Susan to Lieutenant Evers as a way to split up Susan and Johnny. At first, Eve denies ever doing this, though she suddenly remembers that, you know what, it might have been Gwenda who introduced Evers to Susan, but Eve is pretty insistent that she doesn't object to Johnny's now canceled marriage to Susan if Johnny really loves Susan, but Eve knows he doesn't. Campion attends the wine tasting. Present there are Don Evers, Campion's uncle, the Bishop of Devizes, and Stavros. Stavros had instructions from Theodore Bush not to open the wine until everyone was present, but neither Bush nor Johnny Corrados have showed up, and the wine has to be decanted. The bishop opens the wine, and he examines the label and the cork, and he determines the wine is most likely a 1904 Les Enfants Doux. He then lauds Campion and Evers with this really long story about the wine, but the short of it is that this wine is largely unknown because it's not for commercial sale. But the bishop inherited 6 cases of the wine during the war, and all 6 cases made their way to England. However, the bishop stored the wine in Bush's museum, and Bush was pretty slow and hesitant to move out his collection during the Blitz. So when he eventually did so, a lorry, or as we would say in America, a truck, carrying the wine and other items almost certainly got destroyed in a bombing, but no remnants were found to prove it. We're also told one of the items in the same lorry was the girth chalice, which we last saw in Look to the Lady, so the nice continuity there. So there's a lot of intrigue over this wine because it might be stolen, it might not be the correct wine. Where did it come from? The bishop examines the label and the cork and all that, and more or less determines that this bottle did come from his collection. However, the wine tasting is interrupted when Campion receives a panicked phone call from Johnny Corrado saying he needs Campion to come immediately, and he, quote, killed the blighter, unquote. So Campion travels to Bush's house, and Dolly Chivers is there keeping guard, but Theo Bush is dead. He was poisoned by chloral, and as Johnny explains it, Bush wanted something called Zozo, which is some kind of like French antacid medication, but it's very difficult to find since the war broke out. Johnny had some, and he promised to bring them to Bush. As is his custom, Johnny wrote it down on a notepad in his house that Bush wanted the Zozo, and someone in the household would get it for him. He used to do this for his butler, but he doesn't have a butler anymore, so just anyone in the house would do it. And someone did get them for Johnny, but Johnny has no idea who. However, some of the Zozo files were actually filled with a chloral substance left over from Johnny's sleeping medication. Bush gulped one of these down and died. Johnny also mentions that Bush believed the Les Enfants du wine to be fake. Then we get the announcement that Bush is actually alive. The doctor Johnny had called had revived him and barely saved him in time. But now there's, I guess, you guessed it, a new problem. Lady Carrados has shown up to cause more problems. She has an aversion to the truth, and her lies just constantly make everything worse than they need to be because she's just so overprotective of Johnny. Johnny basically screams at her to tell the truth, which his mother seems just completely unable to do. She does bring bad news in that Moppet's clothes have been found in Johnny's bedroom. She insists the clothes weren't there when she found the body, and the medicine bottle that she found next to Moppet, yeah, she actually switched that one out, but the police don't know that yet. The actual bottle that was there was the medication Bush was just poisoned with, and the bottle was super old. This medication is for Johnny's sleeping issues, and he was warned never to take the last dose because the poison could settle on the bottom. This is the same thing that happened in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I'll say no more to spoil that. But Lady Carrados just goes on and on about this girl's murder and how it has nothing to do with them, so it was okay for her to fiddle around with the crime scene and tell all these lies. She also mentions that she told her so and then stops her. And Johnny gets the impression that his mother had recently met with Moppet, but she stumbles around before saying no, she was referring to Gwenda. So she told Gwenda the murder had nothing to do with them. But Lady Carrados just continues to make things worse by lying to everyone, complaining about the police, etc. Campion tries to make an escape from this disaster, but he comes across Superintendent Eo, who has suddenly showed up to cause more problems. And Campion tells him there's absolutely not a felony being committed upstairs, which, not at all suspicious here. But who is suspicious is this other officer who appeared very quickly. That officer was actually Mr. Peary, the restaurateur, who Campion has suspected had been following him. And he also believes that Mr. Peary was the taxi driver who kidnapped him, but Campion eventually does leave, only to have the eerie feeling he's being followed once again. He hears footsteps chasing him, and when you're Albert Campion, it's a pretty safe bet you're being followed. He gets followed pretty much in every novel he appears in, and Campion, runs all over the place trying to dodge his chaser, and he eventually does. And where he winds up is near Corrado Square, specifically in a pig pen where who should show up but Lugg. Lugg did make a run for it to protect his own interests because he was wanted by the police, after they started getting suspicious of Lady Carrados. And Lugg also admitted to calling the police and giving them Campion's name, but he only did so because he thought Campion had left on the train. He thought Campion wouldn't have been caught up in it. Lugg didn't know that Campion had been kidnapped and thus hadn't left London. But this is also where we meet Lugg's pet pig. He is very attached to this pig, even going so far as to talk to her as if she were a baby. And the reason why Lugg actually stayed in London instead of going to someplace safer from the police is because he couldn't bear to be away from his pet pig. And this is my absolute favorite character moment for Lugg in any of these Campion novels. It just lives rent-free in my head. I think of Campion and this pig all the time. It's like the first thing I think of when I think of Lugg. But we're not done with reunions here. It turns out Campion was being followed, but by this time he was being followed by his old friend Stanislaus Oates again. The three go to where Lugg is living. I would not describe this building as a house. Lugg has basically been living in like a burnt out shell of a building, which is exactly where you would expect Lugg to be living. And we're even told he has photos of pigs on the wall, because of course he does. But there, Oates clears some things up. Basically, his sort of gruff attitude toward Campion is a result of a few things. I mean, one, he wanted Campion to stay in London because he needed help with the case. Also, since the war began, Oates has been very desensitized to murder. He sees murder all the time. He's not even bothered by the war. He says, as unpleasant as war has rules and it has a purpose and it has an end goal. What he can't stand anymore is this attitude where everyone has their decency sort of shed, that it's every man for himself. Specifically, Oates has been investigating a series of treasure thefts, in particular, one involving that lorry that had the wine on it. These kinds of heists have been going on regularly since the war began, and Oates finds this despicable. He finds this worse than murder, he finds it worse than the war, and although, quite a few perpetrators have been caught, Oates has no idea who the ringleader is. He suspects it might be Johnny Carrados. The job would require someone of prominent standing to pull it off, and all the roads seem to lead back to him. There is other evidence as well, including several known conspirators having written to Johnny at various points. Oates interviewed Johnny about this, multiple times over the years, and Johnny said he had no idea what was going on. And Oates says that, like, as much as he suspected Johnny really did not seem to understand at all what was going on. He had to be a really good actor to pull it off. But Campion suggests that someone might be using Johnny's address and name because, Johnny was in and out of England frequently, and his house is occupied by any number of different people at any given time. But Oates can't entirely buy Johnny's innocence because of another incident in which this, like, lunatic member of the aristocracy contacted Johnny because his greenhouse was bombed and he lost a lot of rare plants. He was also said to be hiding some of the treasure, and Johnny said he would take care of it. And Johnny really did write back to him because he had it framed. Although Johnny says like he didn't know anything sinister was going on. And this meeting between Campion and Oates is interrupted by Campion's secretary Tovey. Apparently, an expert art dealer named Sloane has come to Scotland Yard, and he says he knows where some of the stolen treasures is. In fact, he's come across a lot of stolen treasures in a room belonging to this woman, and he's certain they're genuine. Don Evers was summoned to the yard, and he brought the bishop with him. So Campion and Oates go to Scotland Yard to check all this out. Basically, Sloane said this woman was holding the art for a friend, which, all this excuse in the book. But Evers is concerned because his father reported that some of the stolen loot was there. And Oates and Campion go to meet with this woman. She's an older woman named Dorothy Pork, which, again, absolutely fantastic name. It's remarked upon in the novel, even, how great this name is. And Miss Pork is not exactly a friendly individual. She's not mean, but, she just has absolutely no time or interest in Campion or Oates. But she's pretty loose with information, and she's actually an old friend of Susan's, which Evers had already mentioned. But Miss Pork has in her possession just crates full of treasures that were either allegedly stolen or destroyed, and they are the genuine articles. As she says, she was paid to store them there, and she had the crates for about 8 to 10 months. She's not really sure how long, but a woman from the storage firm came to pay her to hold the stuff. And Miss Pork openly talks about how some of the items came from Johnny Carrados, although she's never met Johnny before. But clearly Susan had put this idea out there. She has never actually even been in contact with Johnny. She's only been in contact with that woman from the storage broker. And she did write to Johnny 2 days prior, however, because Miss Pork was forced to put some of the items on display because the cellar she was storing the crates in was damp and the art could have been destroyed. And she wrote to Johnny because she had some visitors and she didn't want Johnny to think like she was like claiming this art for herself by putting it on display. She shows Campion and Oates the damp cellar, and she talks a lot about how damp her cellar is. It's actually very strange how much she talks about it. But her maid summons Miss Pork and tells her a man and a woman have arrived. And the man is Johnny Corrados, and the woman, the maid says, is the same woman from the storage firm. And this woman turns out to be Dolly Chivers. And you know what? This is where I end the spoiler free section. So back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. There's actually quite still a lot of the book left to cover, but we do get a big reveal coming up, so this is where I will end the spoiler free section. Johnny explains to Miss Pork that there's some kind of misunderstanding. Most of the items in her possession do not belong to him. He never wrote to her. He never sent her any items to be stored there. The only thing that actually belongs to Johnny there is a cardboard puppet theater, and it's not even Johnny's, it's Ricky Silva's. And Miss Pork believes Johnny, but then she asks Miss Chivers why she misled her when she visited a year ago. And Miss Chivers denies ever having done so, but Miss Pork is just not buying this. She wants to know why Miss Chivers visited her a year ago and said all the stuff was Johnny's. Both the maid and Miss Pork recognize her as the representative from the storage firm. And Campion recognizes Miss Chivers as she's holding a gun, actually, that's what he realizes. And he throws something at a chandelier, which causes it to crash, and it scatters glass all over the place. This does stun Miss Chivers long enough so she doesn't kill Miss Pork, as she was going to, but she also winds up running. And unfortunately for her, she falls into, I guess it's a chute of some kind. As many times as I've read this novel, I've never really understood what exactly Miss Chivers falls into. It almost sounds like it's some kind of like chimney, but it's outside on the ground. I wish we had a screen adaptation of this novel so I could see what it looks like, but we don't. This book has never been adapted for the screen. But anyway, Miss Chivers dies from the impact, and Allingham writes that Campion could hear the sounds of her bones crashing into the concrete, which, very chilling. Oates is still convinced Johnny has to be involved. It's just too much of a coincidence that once again Johnny was able to worm his way out of the situation just before he was caught red-handed. But as Campion explains, had he and Oates not been there, what would have happened is that Miss Chivers would have murdered Miss Pork with Johnny's gun, and his fingerprints would have been all over it. And Campion also explains that Miss Chivers had been doing this all along, and she speculates that Miss Chivers is the one who murdered Moppet in Johnny's bed to frame him for that, and then also framing Johnny for the poisoning of Theodore Bush. Also, she committed that in a way that clearly led back to Johnny. But Oates is still not convinced, and to be honest, Campion isn't so convinced Johnny is innocent either. Campion and Oates discuss the changes since the war began and how so many apparently upright British citizens turned out to be traitors and fortune hunters. And just because Campion is friends with Johnny from before the war doesn't mean Johnny can't be a traitor or a fortune hunter. After all, Miss Chivers was a very shocking traitor as well. No one suspected she could be behind anything like this. Campion visits the Minoan again, where he finds Stavros and Mr. Peary. Campion asked Peary if it was Dolly Chivers who sold him those bottles of Les Enfants wine. And cornered, Peary makes a clean breast of things. It wasn't Dolly Chivers, it was Moppet who approached him about the wine, with the promise of there being more. However, Peary bought the wine from Moppet, who did get it from Dolly Chivers. But when it came time to sell more wine, Moppet kept dodging the promise. She couldn't get any more wine, and then she said she needed more money to get it. Peary distrusted her, so one night he followed her, and he followed her to Corrado Square and watched her go in, but she never came out. And the only people who entered the building that night were a woman who looked like Miss Chivers, but Peary never met her, so he's not really sure, and he doesn't know her. And Lady Corrados also entered the building. Peary kept watch all night until the ambulance came, and he followed the ambulance all the way to Campion's flat, but he didn't know Moppet was dead by then. He also admitted to kidnapping Campion because he mistakenly thought Moppet had sold Campion some of the wine. Campion says Dolly Chivers murdered Moppet because Moppet was becoming a problem over this wine. Dolly only stole a few bottles of wine because that's all she could take without anyone noticing. She couldn't take whole cases of wine. so she murdered Moppet, who was trying to profit off of this wine, and also probably blackmailing Miss Chivers. Again, not clear. That's what Campion suspects. But neither Campion nor Oates believe Miss Chivers is the mastermind. She was working for someone else, and naturally Oates suspects Johnny. The police found letters in Moppet's apartment that Moppet wrote to Johnny, but it's weird she has all these letters still, like she would have sent them. And Campion does sort of warm up to the idea that maybe it's Johnny, but he's still not completely convinced. And Yale tells Campion that they will not charge Lugg or Lady Carrados with any crime, basically because saying it's the war. No one cares about these sort of things anymore. Eve Snow visits Campion, all in a panic here, and Johnny has gone missing, and he left her a note saying like how he'll always love her. And Campion tells her not to worry, he'll find Johnny, and also that Johnny probably went back to his war work like he said he would, but Eve points out that Johnny was supposed to get married that day, so he shouldn't still be on leave. His leave would have extended beyond then. Johnny also gave his blessing to Susan to marry Don Evers. And Johnny also doesn't show up to the inquest into Dolly Chivers' death, where he's supposed to be. And this is where Campion drops a bombshell here. Miss Chivers' partner was Theodore Bush, and they were married. And this is actually information we got told in the previous chapter. Margery Allingham does this a lot, and it's very frustrating where she sort of like ruins the bombshell reveal before it happens. Like she told us, oh, they were married. It's like, why didn't you just wait till the end to reveal that? She does this in Death of a Ghost is the worst example of this, but pretty bad here too. But Theodore Bush was in on it the whole time. He was in on the smuggling scheme. He was in on looting the treasures. And the ending here for me is a bit weak, to be honest. It's not the solution itself, but we never really get like a thorough explanation as to what's going on. This is a bit symbolic of the work as a whole, where everything is just chaotic. It's not truly explained what happened, but what had to have happened was the Les Enfants du wine at the tasting party was genuine, as identified by Campion's uncle, the bishop. However, this wine shouldn't have been so out in the open, because it can be traced back to the criminal smugglers and the black market. It was supposed to have disappeared entirely, and now that it's shown up out of the blue. And Bush was sort of putting it out there that the wine might have been counterfeit as a way to distance himself from the smuggling operation, because this wine was supposed to be for private use only. And Miss Chivers tried to kill him because he was trying to get the wine bottles back, and also because she hoped his death would cancel the wine tasting where the bishop could identify the wine, because it was just Bush and Evers and Campion tasting the wine. Evers and Campion could have been fooled, and Bush would have just said it would fake. The bishop, however, would not have been fooled. But finally, Campion has once again delivered justice, and after 48 long hours, it actually feels like this book takes place over a much longer period of time, but it's really only 2 days. And Campion finally can catch that train to his ancestral home, but when he arrives, he is denied access because he does not have a clearance, and he's like, well, that's weird, but anyway, confused, he walks around and sees a small white-haired boy and a woman with red hair, and of course we recognize this woman as his wife, Amanda Fitton, who has turned their house into a wartime workspace, Allendale Aerospace. I remember when I first read through the Campion series, I had taken a brief pause after Trader's Purse before picking up this book, and I was thinking the whole time, I was like, didn't Campion have a wife or something? And I thought maybe I just made it up, or Allingham did away with her and I forgot. But no, Amanda is here and is his wife, and that is their son, that little white-haired boy, Rupert, although we're not told his name in this novel, nor are we actually told that's their son, but that is who it is. It's Rupert Campion. And there's lots to praise here for Coroner's Pidgin. Gotta start with Lugg, who is just so fantastic in this novel. I mean, Lugg and his pig are truly my favorite moment, probably in any Campion novel. I mean, Lugg isn't in the book a lot, but when he is, he makes it. He's just so much fun, and I think this novel's biggest strength is the depiction of London in war. I know a lot of people say, like, The Tiger and the Smoke is Allingham's best depiction of London, but I would say it's Coroner's Pidgin, because in this novel, we not only get so many wonderful descriptions of what the city looks like, but also the effects on the characters. I mean, both of those things go hand in hand. We're told about all of these buildings and restaurants that no longer exist, and even Corrado Square is half destroyed, and Lugg is living in a bombed out shell of a house, and all of this has a huge effect on the characters' personalities and allows the plot to move forward because everyone is forced to live together in what remains of Corrado Square. Anyone could be framing Johnny and poisoning Theodore Bush. Because Lugg has lost so much in the war, he refuses to abandon his pig. And because the war is going on and London is being bombed, people are sending their treasures out of the country or into the country, opening up the opportunity for heists and counterfeiting. Because the war has upended everyone's lives, the characters are basically in a dog eat dog world where they're forced to betray each other to survive. And I think Allingham, through Oates, brilliantly explains this when he says the worst thing that's happening in England is everyone turning on each other. And people you could never imagine are vicious traitors and deceiving their loved ones for money. This plot cannot exist in any other time. It is crafted from the events unfolding during the war. And I think mechanics wise, the plot is fantastic. I love the charade with the wine. I love the framing of Johnny. It seems impossible, but understanding the time setting is key to believing it. And I love Dolly Chivers as the murderer, and she fits in very well as, the most shocking person to do it. She fits the theme very well. I love Campion in this novel and his desire to take the train. Allingham never tells us where Campion wants to go on that train, only that he needs to take the train. And Amanda is never mentioned until the very end. I think Dolly Chivers' death scene is fantastic. There's a lot of very well drawn characters like Johnny, his mother, Dorothy Pork. I think the opening chapter is one of the most iconic in detective fiction, with Lugg and the Marchioness carrying Moppet up the stairs and dumping her on Campion's bed. And Campion not even being like that upset this is happening. He's just like annoyed that he's been delayed. And there's a lot of continuity with past novels like Trader's Purse and Fashion in the Shrouds and Look to the Lady. If you've read Look to the Lady and remember what was going on with the Girth Chalice, which is mentioned in this novel, it might provide you with a little bit of a clue. I'll say no more. And this book remains number one on my ranking of every Campion novel. I never considered moving it otherwise. I don't think I would ever consider moving this otherwise. I know people say Tiger in the Smoke. I personally think Coroner's Pidgin is the best Campion novel. For criticism, I really don't have all that much here, as one would expect for a number one ranked novel. I mean, most of my issues with Coroner's Pidgin are mostly the same criticisms I have of Allingham in general. Like at the beginning of this novel, she sets up a lot of very good, interesting characters like Eve Snow, the Admiral, Ricky Silva, the Oyners, only for her to not use them very much afterward. Like, even the Marchioness is like barely in it after the opening scene. And the Oyners especially, I think, are egregious here because they are set up rather sinisterly at one point, only for that to go absolutely nowhere. She does set up a more domestic murder, only for the crime to be a grand heist, which is fine. But she does this sort of like switch tones in the middle of the novel. She does that a lot. Allingham's novels are usually a mix of like mystery and thriller. She often sets up plot lines and doesn't complete them or fully explain them. She does that here. She doesn't really give a summation gathering to explain the wine and the pearls. You do sort of have to piece things together a little bit, which is fun and it's creative, but this is a mystery novel. It should have been explained by the author. And it's not like it's so obscure you really have to sit there and think about it, but still. And she also deflates the big surprise that Theodore Bush is involved by telling us he's married to Dolly Chivers just before Campion reveals this in court. Allingham has a habit of doing this a lot, where she basically tells us who's involved and before the big reveal, and it really deflates the drama and the excitement a bit. And she does this in Death of a Ghost, and it's so infuriating there. It's not as bad here, but I mean, these are just things that relate to Allingham in general. And even though Coroner's Pidgin is my favorite Allingham novel and it's the best Allingham novel, it still has a lot of those, not a lot of those flaws, but it still has some of those flaws that I think many of the Campion novels have. It's just Margery Allingham's style, her writing style, her plotting style, that I think sometimes it leaves a little bit to be desired, but still, in this particular novel, those things don't matter nearly as much as they do in the others. Let's talk about our hero, Albert Campion. I should say the new and improved Albert Campion. This book features a very mature and wiser Campion for the first time. We no longer have that impetuous young man running around squirting people with water guns and competing in acts of dangerous daring do. We have a man matured by the pains of war and by marriage and fatherhood, and yet he still feels like Albert Campion. He doesn't feel like a new person. It had been years since a Campion novel had been published when Coroner's Pidgin debuted, and he still feels so familiar and but understandably different. Allingham depicts his struggles very beautifully in this book with his constant thoughts about getting on that train like he wants to, but also helping Lugg and his friends and his defense of his friend Johnny Corrados. He does not abandon his friends. And I did like his investigations as well, where he doesn't actually do a lot of the traditional sleuthing. He functions more like a Poirot or really even a Miss Marple in this novel. And I thought he was absolutely delightful here. Again, spectacular appearance from Albert Campion. And it's the same from Lugg. I mean, Lugg is always a joy. He's definitely way too low on my sidekick ranking. I should redo that video. And this is my favorite novel for Lugg content, with him and his prized pig, and his house is decorated with pig pictures, one of which is apparently his pig's grandmother, but again, he could have been joking. I'm not really sure. I do wish Lugg was in it more, but he does understandably disappear for a bit. It makes sense for the plot that he does. And I love how he didn't flee to safety because he just couldn't abandon his pig. Like, I don't recall us ever getting a name for the pig. We might have. I could be wrong on that. But, I mean, you can just see Lugg's fondness for Campion in this novel as well. It's not as great as it is for the pig, but, here he tries hard not to get Campion involved, only for that to fail. It doesn't get commented on in this book, but Lugg always has this thing of trying to get Campion to better himself because Campion is an upperclassman and he shouldn't be hanging out with like people like Lugg and doing all these weird crimes and all things. He's always trying to get Campion to distance himself from the shady underworld figures, and that finally happens in this book. We get no commentary on it, but I'm sure Lugg was very happy with his employer nonetheless. And then we have Stanislaus Oates in what I would consider his last full novel. I mean, he does appear in other novels going forward, but we start getting the likes of Charles Luke, who I never really cared for, and Luke does start inching out Oates over time in the novels. But I really liked Oates in this novel. He and Campion did not always have this buddy buddy relationship, and this novel we do see that relationship do a little bit of reversion back to that tense state, although it is easily explained. Oates swears he doesn't suspect Campion and trusts him, but does he? Oates is very cold to Campion at points, and it's because Oates has seen a lot during the war, and he knows anyone could be a traitor, and that includes Campion, and he questions Campion's, mental state. He trusts no one, and he's not even willing to believe Campion, who repeatedly tells him Johnny is innocent. Oates has been rendered stoic by the Times, which I think reflects the reality for many citizens during the Blitz. Oates is the godfather of Campion's child, or maybe it's the other way around, or both, even. That's just how close these two men are, but here, he's still struggling to trust Campion, a sign of the times. But I really like Oates in general, and especially in this novel. He's never as good as Lugg, though, but no one ever is. Onto our culprits, starting with Dolly Chivers, who is more symbolic than anything else. I mean, she is the least likely culprit. And while the least likely culprit is stereotypically, the murderer, it actually rarely turns out to be the case in detective fiction. It's often the most likely suspect. That's the twist of these books. But here, it really is the least likely suspect because of that overwhelming theme that you just can't trust anyone anymore. And Dolly Chivers is this, sexless, harmless woman. At least that's how we're introduced to her. But she's actually a vicious murderer, traitor, thief. It's very unexpected that she is not only the killer, but just how ruthless she is. And she is the secretary. That is one of the occupations I say to look out for in my How to Solve a Mystery Novel video. Secretaries know things and they have access to certain information that allows them to commit these crimes. And we see her do this throughout the novel. She's taking charge of situations and she's getting involved. After Theo Bush is poisoned, other parts when things get messy. Very clearly she's the one moving the plot and she's the one who's putting this framing of Johnny right in front of us, and it's so easy to miss. And then we have Theo Bush, who I think is our more traditional culprit. He did not murder anyone as far as known, but the duo of Bush and Chivers reminded me a lot of the evil duo in NRM. I won't say who they are because I won't spoil NRM here. But one is the unsuspecting culprit, and the other is this upstanding member of the community whose identity as a traitor is still unsuspected, but is more like typical. It's more what you would expect of who a traitor would be in these kinds of stories. And Bush, is the person entrusted with people's most valuable possessions, and he betrays them by stealing them. And I think we're supposed to believe that he turned evil in the war, and had it not been for the war, Bush would have remained a good guy. Unlike NRM, our traitors here are traitors in the personal sense, but because they portrayed a fellow citizen, it's portrayed as they betrayed the country as well. These are not the NRM villains who are, sharing state secrets and all of that. And Margery Allingham finds this particularly odious, as she explains through Oates. Sharing secrets, that's part of the war. That's fair game. That's what you expect people to do in the war. But betraying your fellow countrymen for money and stealing their possessions is horrid. And we see at the end of this novel where Bush is just particularly indignant about being found out. It's not the same sort of way as when you capture a Nazi, at the end of the war. It's really gross from him, and he's just so annoyed and like, how dare Campion stop this, because he's not hurting the British war effort. He's on the side of Britain. He wants Britain to win the war, but he didn't do anything wrong. And that's how he's portrayed, and that's how Allingham feels, that these people are terrible. They're worse than war, because the enemies in war are understandable in their actions. They're fighting for their home, they're fighting for their lives. Like, Theodore Bush is just greedy, and she doesn't like that. Not much to say about our victim in Moppet Lewis Stavros. We don't ever really learn anything about her, but she is a symbolic victim of the war. I mean, she is the example of what happens when you start acting in your own interest instead of the interest of your fellow citizens and your country and the greater good. Like, again, we don't learn a lot about her. We don't know a lot about her. She seems like a pretty awful person. I mean, just going on what she did, and also the way she sort of just like intruded herself into Corrado Square uninvited and started like wearing everybody's clothes and everything. She seems pretty awful. Again, I don't necessarily say she's our like jerk victim because we just simply don't know that much about her. But again, I thought she was a very effective victim considering what she stood for. Onto our regular characters, we have Johnny Corrados, who is our war hero of sorts, another victim in a way. I mean, the way the villains of this novel just constantly take advantage of Johnny and his war work and his kind heart for evil is despicable, and they frame Johnny for it. And Johnny spends so much of the novel just completely blindsided about what's happening around him, just completely unaware his friends aren't all they claim to be. Like, even the ones not like in the smuggling ring, like the likes of the Oiners are just using him, and Ricky Silva is using him. And he's, very nice guy. He's very gentlemanly. He's going to marry Susan because he promised his late friend to look after her. And while I think nowadays that seems a little old fashioned, a little chauvinistic even, he realizes that Susan's in love with Don Evers and lets her go. The end does imply Johnny will marry Eve Snow, which is interesting because Campion, and thus the reader, is sort of under the impression that Johnny and Eve are just mainly like physical partners. I got the impression they're like Archie Goodwin and Lily Rowan, and they're not actually committed. But again, the war does things. The war changed Campion, the war changed Johnny as well. It is implied they're going to get married, and this is the correct choice. We have Susan Sharing, Johnny's fiance, who I thought was interesting. She doesn't actually have a lot to do, like, in terms of the plot, like the smuggling plot, but she does add a lot to the atmosphere and the tone of the novel. She's a very young widow playing into the tragedy of the times, but she's not, how can I put this right? She's not like a weeping widow. She's an independent woman, and I really liked how she cared for Johnny, but she didn't love him. It did not come across as superficial. It did not come across as she was using him. She appreciated Johnny, and she's really the only one of Johnny's friends who does appreciate him. for his kindness and not just using him for something else. But she realized that she could not marry Johnny, and her not wanting to call off the wedding was a bit of a conundrum for her because it had nothing to do with Moppet's death, though it would look like that. She had to wait. But then eventually the wedding gets called off anyway, and it's much the better for her and for Johnny. Johnny's mother, the Dowager Marchioness, I thought she was a fantastic character, causing all of this ridiculous drama and just compounding problem after problem for no real reason. I mean, constantly lying to Scotland Yard over easily disproved things and not keeping her story straight. I do think Margery Allingham underuses her. She doesn't actually appear that much in the book, especially outside of the beginning chapter or two. But her influence is constantly there. She's the inciting incident of the sorts. I would consider the inciting incident to be a person in this novel, and she's the reason the plot of the book happens by moving Moppet's body and switching the bottles and lying. It's constantly mentioned that she doesn't even know what she's doing. I sort of get the impression she is aware of what she's doing, and this is sort of her last hurrah as a haughty aristocrat to use her influence for her own needs. After the war, and there was this sort of sentiment during the war. The class system in Britain is about to take a hit here. One of the big quandaries of World War II is what will happen to the aristocratic class, and Niall Marsh explores this in Scales of Justice, which is also on our summer travel list coming up in the months ahead. Where it's the aristocrats, they were the most important people and they had to be protected and their status had to be protected. And that is what the Dowager is doing here. But I found the Dowager just a wonderful comic relief character, but also it needed to be in the book a little bit more, though perhaps this is an example of, just a little bit of her goes a long way. Lieutenant Don Evers, and I will say lieutenant, not lieutenant, because he is American. And he's the more subdued version of Johnny. He's the military hero who is fully dedicated to the task. He's American, and I think that influences his character quite a bit, as he's not overly concerned with things like expensive wine and royal treasures. He's there to do the job and return home. There are no stakes for him, except for Susan Sharing. And I think Don Evers is a fascinating character, not in himself, but in the way Allingham uses him. She uses him as a technique to set up Johnny, actually, as the red herring culprit, because Margery Allingham is not going to let Susan suffer. Susan is going to have a happy ending, and she is going to get married. And by having Don Evers there, he's the backup husband for Susan. So that does open the possibility of Johnny being the culprit. Because if there is no other man, Allingham's not going to leave Susan alone, so Johnny has to be innocent. But that's not the case here. And this is still a red herring, but it's a wonderful red herring. I'm often critical of red herrings because a lot of them seem like obvious decoys, just okay, we see right through this. But this one does not. I think this one is very effective. And we have Eve Snow, who is Johnny's main woman. I found her another of these characters who was set up wonderfully, but then just wasn't utilized to her full potential. But she is something of a voice of reason compared to her main rival, Gwenda Onier. And Eve comes off as much more sympathetic figure, although one we're never really primed to cheer for. There's never any point in this novel where I would say oh, you're rooting for Johnny and Eve to get together. And I would not say Eve is, the heroine of this novel, so to speak. I mean, that's more Susan Sharing. And we have Dorothy Pork, she of the damp cellar. And, she can't go two sentences without mentioning that damp cellar. And I really liked her. And she's definitely one of the best, tertiary characters in a mystery novel. I mean, she's not even, a supporting character. But she was a lot of fun in, the two chapters she appeared in. She did appear to be a little flighty. But in the end, she was shrewd. And I love just how she doesn't care about what's going on with Campion and Oates. She's not at all impressed Oates is from Scotland Yard. Miss Pork lives in the countryside, so she's way from the Blitz mostly. And the contrast is felt. She's not concerned with the same things the Londoners are concerned with. And in the middle of all this, she just complains that she can't help because she has things to do. I believe she has to set up the flowers in the church. And she's just totally uninterested with the Scotland Yard and what they're doing. And she's just so far detached from London and the action that she's not even really aware of what's going on. Although once she's brought into it, she does realize what's happening. And I'm going to lump in a few characters together here. Peter and Gwenda Onier with Ricky Silva. They don't really do enough to warrant their own slot, but they also fit very well together. I mean, these are basically the trio freeloading off of Johnny. Margery Allingham, I think, a little unfairly mocks them. I mean, the war is going on. They probably lost their homes. It's not made clear explicitly. Margery Allingham treats these three with the same disdain as she treats, like, the smugglers as people who aren't helping the war effort, and they aren't helping themselves. I mean, the Oniers especially, Gwenda, are depicted very unsavory. I mean, Peter Onier is Johnny's, like, financial person. Gwenda is set up on multiple occasions as being, like, the big bad here. They never get, like, genuine positive moments. And I think Allingham looks at these three people as very similar to people in real life who weren't contributing much of anything to the war effort. This is more prominently explored in not one of Allingham's mystery novels, but in her nonfiction work, The Oaken Heart, which is about her experience in Essex and how her home village was preparing for the war and a potential German invasion, and how everyone in that village had a role to play and patriotism was a must, and if you didn't, you were pretty much useless. That's sort of where I get, the Peter and Gwenda Oniers and Ricky Silva. Again, they're not doing anything, they're not helpful. They're not like the villains of the piece, but they are treated pretty villainously, to be honest. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Coroner's Pidgin, also called Pearls Before Swine. I believe I neglected to mention that at the beginning of this video like I meant to. This is my personal favorite Albert Campion novel. I think it's the best Albert Campion novel. I don't think it's really that close. Again, I know people say The Tiger and the Smoke is by far Margery Allingham's best work. Again, I would disagree respectfully. But next week, we have another fun video I have not done in a while here. I have 6 more Agatha Christie conspiracy theories, unanswered questions, what have you. Those were always a lot of fun, a lot of discussions always happening about those. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.